The sleek private jet gleamed under the pale Oregon sun, its polished hull reflecting the gray clouds overhead. Inside, the cabin smelled of leather and money, plush seats, gold-trimmed armrests, a faint hum of luxury that made every passenger feel like they'd hit the jackpot. The soft murmur of ambient music drifted through the air as folks settled in, some sipping champagne from crystal flutes, others scrolling their phones like it was just another Tuesday. But today wasn't ordinary. Not by a long shot. Naomi Carter stepped aboard with the kind of quiet that turns heads. She didn't strut or flash a smile. She didn't need to. Dressed in a navy blazer and slacks that fit like they were made for her, she moved with a steady grace, her dark eyes sweeping the cabin for a split second before landing on her seat near the front. At 39, Naomi had built an empire. Carter Air, the airline that owned this very plane, but nobody here knew that. Not yet. She liked it that way, blending in, watching the world she'd created from the shadows. Today wasn't about a vacation or a business trip. It was about seeing if her people still lived up to the one thing she cared about most: respect. Laura Hensley stood by the entrance, her crisp uniform hugging her frame like a second skin. At 43, she ran this plane like a drill sergeant, sharp features, sharper tongue, and a smile she could flip on or off depending on who you were. She greeted passengers with a practiced nod, her voice warm for some, ice cold for others. "Good morning, Mr. Delaney," she said brightly as Frank Delaney, a gray-haired businessman in his 60s, shuffled past with a nod and a folded newspaper tucked under his arm. "Pleasure to have you again." Frank grunted a thanks, his weathered face showing mild curiosity as he took his seat across the aisle. Then came Naomi. Laura's eyes narrowed just a hair, her smile tightening as she sized her up. "Welcome aboard," she said, the words clipped, no trace of the warmth she'd just handed Frank. Naomi nodded back, unfazed, and slid into her seat, tucking her small leather bag underneath. She caught the shift in Laura's tone, the way her shoulders stiffened, but she didn't react. Not yet. She'd seen this dance before. Folks making snap judgments based on nothing but their own biases, and she'd learned long ago to let it play out. The cabin buzzed with a low hum of chatter as the plane taxied toward the runway. Frank flipped open his newspaper, scanning the headlines with a squint. Across from him, a couple of well-dressed types sipped their drinks, their expensive luggage stowed overhead. Grace Miller, the junior flight attendant, darted around with a nervous energy, her blonde ponytail bouncing as she offered pillows and smiles to anyone who'd take them. At 28, Grace was still green, her soft voice barely cutting through the noise, but she tried hard, too hard, maybe, to keep things smooth. Laura moved through the aisle like she owned the place, her polished shoes clicking against the carpet. She stopped by Frank, her smile back in full force. "Anything I can get you before takeoff, Mr. Delaney?" she asked, all sugar and spice. Frank waved her off. "Coffee's fine," he said, not looking up from his paper. She nodded and moved on, her eyes sliding past Naomi without a flicker of interest. Naomi watched her go, her fingers resting lightly on the armrest. She didn't need a drink or a pillow. She needed to see how this crew treated people when they thought no one important was watching. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. Laura circled back, her tray of sparkling water glinting under the cabin lights. She served Frank first, then the couple in the back, chatting them up like old friends. Naomi waited, patient as a saint, until Laura finally passed her again. "Excuse me," Naomi said, her voice low but clear. "Could I have some water, please?" Laura froze mid-step, glancing over with a look that could curdle milk. "I'll get to you when I can," she snapped, brushing past without a second thought. Naomi's jaw tightened, but she didn't push it. She leaned back, her dark eyes tracking Laura's every move. The plane climbed into the sky, the engines humming steady as the ground fell away. Passengers relaxed, the chatter dying down, but the air around Naomi felt heavier. Laura returned a few minutes later, tray in hand, her sharp gaze catching Naomi's legs stretching slightly into the aisle. It wasn't much, just a small shift to get comfortable, but Laura pounced like a cat on a mouse. She veered hard, her foot clipping Naomi's shin, and the tray tipped. Water splashed everywhere. Onto Naomi's lap, the floor, the seat, cold and sudden. Laura gasped loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. "Watch where you're putting your legs," she barked. "You've caused a mess." Heads turned. Frank lowered his paper, frowning. Grace froze halfway down the aisle, her hands clutching a blanket. Naomi looked up, water dripping from her slacks, but her face stayed calm. Too calm, maybe. "You walked into my leg," she said, brushing at the damp fabric. Her voice was even, almost gentle, but it carried a steel that made Laura blink. "I've only asked to be treated with the same respect as everyone else. If that's too much, maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here." The words hit like a quiet thunderclap. Laura's face flushed red, her lips curling into a sneer. She stepped closer, towering over Naomi's seat. "You think you can talk to me like that?" she hissed. Then, in a flash, her hand shot up and cracked across Naomi's cheek. The slap echoed through the cabin, sharp and ugly, freezing everyone in place. Frank half stood, his newspaper crumpling in his lap. Grace's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide. The couple in the back gasped, their drinks forgotten. Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't touch her face or yell. She just straightened slow, her hand resting calm on her lap, her gaze locking onto Laura's. The cabin went dead silent, the tension thick enough to choke on. Laura stood there, breathing hard, her hands still raised like she couldn't believe what she'd done. Naomi's eyes didn't waver, dark, steady, and heavy with something Laura couldn't read. "You just made the worst mistake of your life," Naomi said, her voice soft but slicing through the air like a blade. Laura faltered, her smirk slipping for half a second before she forced it back. "Oh, please," she scoffed, folding her arms. "What are you going to do about it?" Naomi didn't answer. She didn't need to. She reached for her phone, typed something quick, and set it back down on the armrest. The move was small, deliberate, and it sent a shiver through Laura she couldn't shake. Frank leaned forward, his brow furrowed, like he knew something was coming. Grace edged closer to the galley, her fingers trembling as she clutched the passenger list. The plane soared higher, but the real storm was brewing right there in the cabin. Laura turned away, muttering under her breath, but her steps weren't as steady as before. Naomi sat still, water staining her clothes, her face a mask of calm that hid a fire nobody saw coming. Whatever she just set in motion, it was big, and Laura was about to find out how deep she'd dug her own grave. If you're rooting for justice, hit that like button and subscribe to see what happens next. The cabin felt like a pressure cooker after that slap, the air thick with whispers and sideways glances. Naomi Carter sat there, water still dripping from her slacks onto the plush carpet, her cheeks stinging where Laura Hensley's hand had landed. But her face? Calm as a lake at dawn. She didn't rub her face or snap back. She just watched Laura, her dark eyes steady, like she was sizing up a puzzle she already knew how to solve. Laura, meanwhile, stood a few feet away, arms crossed tight, her chest heaving like she'd just run a mile. Her sharp features twisted into something between smug and rattled, like she wasn't sure if she'd won or stepped in something nasty. Frank Delaney folded his newspaper slow, his gray eyes flicking between the two women. He'd seen a lot in his 62 years, boardroom fights, barroom brawls, but this was something else. He cleared his throat, loud enough to cut through the murmurs. "That was out of line," he said, his voice gruff but firm, aimed square at Laura. A couple heads nodded, but most folks just stared, waiting to see what had happened next. Laura shot him a look that could have peeled paint. "Sir, I'd appreciate it if you stayed out of this," she snapped, her tone dripping with that fake politeness she perfected over the years. Naomi didn't move. She brushed a stray drop of water off her blazer, her fingers steady as ever. The slap had turned heads, sure, but it was Laura's attitude that kept them turned, the way she'd strutted through this plane like she owned it, picking who got a smile and who got a sneer. Naomi had clocked it from the jump. The warm hello for Frank, the cold shoulder for her. Now, with her lap soaked and her face smarting, she knew this wasn't just about a spilled tray or a seat mix-up. It was bigger. It was about the kind of rot that festers when people think they can judge you by your skin or your quiet. Laura turned back to Naomi, her lips curling into a smirk. "You gonna sit there all high and mighty after causing a scene?" she said, loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. "Maybe if you'd moved when I told you, we wouldn't be here." Her voice had that edge, like she was daring Naomi to push back. The couple in the back whispered to each other, their champagne glasses forgotten. A woman with too much perfume and a nosy streak leaned over her seat, craning her neck for a better view. Grace Miller, the junior attendant, hovered near the galley, her hands twisting the edge of her apron. She wanted to say something. Her wide blue eyes screamed it, but Laura's glare kept her pinned. Naomi tilted her head just a fraction, her voice low but clear. "I didn't cause this," she said. "You did. All I asked for was a glass of water and a little respect. You gave me neither." The words hung there, simple but heavy, like stones dropped in still water. Frank nodded, a faint grunt of approval escaping him. Laura's smirk faltered, but she doubled down, stepping closer. "Respect?" she scoffed. "Maybe you should earn it first. People like you don't just get it handed to them." The cabin went quiet, the hum of the engines the only sound left. Frank's jaw tightened, and he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Lady," he said to Laura, "you're digging a hole you might not climb out of." Laura whipped her head around. "I said stay out of it," she barked, but her voice cracked just enough to betray her. She turned back to Naomi, pointing a finger. "You're not supposed to be up here. This section's for elite passengers, and I don't care what you say. I know who belongs." Naomi didn't blink. "You might want to check that passenger list before you keep talking," she said, her tone even but laced with something sharp. Laura laughed, a short, harsh sound. "I don't need a list to know you're out of place," she shot back. "Now, you can move to the back, or I'll have Grace escort you there myself." She jerked her head toward Grace, who flinched like she'd been slapped too. "Grace!" Laura snapped. "Get over here and deal with this." Grace hesitated, her ponytail swaying as she took a shaky step forward. She glanced at Naomi, then at Laura, her hands trembling. "Maybe we should check the list," she mumbled, barely audible. Laura's eyes narrowed. "What did you say?" she hissed. Grace swallowed hard, her voice a whisper. "I just think, maybe we should double-check." Laura cut her off with a wave of her hand. "I've got this under control," she said, her tone venomous. "You don't need to think. Just do what I say." Grace bit her lip, her face flushing red. She took another step, then stopped, her eyes darting to the clipboard hanging near the galley. Naomi watched her, a flicker of something. Hope? Maybe. Crossing her face. "You don't have to do this," Naomi said softly, just loud enough for Grace to hear. "Think about what's right." Grace froze, caught between Laura's glare and Naomi's quiet strength. The cabin held its breath, every eye on the standoff. Laura wasn't having it. She stormed over to Grace, snatched the clipboard from the wall, and shoved it into her hands. "Fine," she spat. "Check it if it'll shut you up. But I'm telling you, she's not on it." Grace fumbled with the pages, her fingers shaking as she scanned the names. Laura loomed over her, arms crossed, her foot tapping like a countdown clock. The nosy woman in the back whispered loud enough for half the plane to hear. "She's probably trying to sneak a free upgrade." Typical. Frank snorted, loud and deliberate. "Typical's the lady who thinks she can slap folks and get away with it," he muttered, just enough to make Laura's ears burn. She glared at him but didn't bite back, not yet. Her focus stayed on Grace, who was flipping through the list with a growing frown. "Hurry up," Laura snapped. Grace's eyes widened, her fingers stopping on a line near the bottom. She looked up at Naomi, then at Laura, her voice barely a squeak. She's here," she said. "Naomi Carter. Seat 3A. Laura's smirk vanished. "What?" she said, snatching the clipboard from Grace's hands. She stared at the page, her lips pressing into a thin line. "That's impossible," she muttered, her voice losing its edge. Naomi leaned back in her seat, crossing her legs slow and deliberate. "Told you to check," she said, her tone calm but cutting. Laura's face flushed a deeper red, her hands gripping the clipboard like she wanted to snap it in half. This doesn't change anything, she said, louder now, like she was trying to convince herself. You're still causing trouble. Naomi didn't rise to the bait. She reached for her phone again, her fingers brushing the screen for a moment before setting it back down. Trouble's what you're in, she said, her voice steady as steel. Laura scoffed, but sounded forced. You think you're special because your name's on some list? She said. I've dealt with worse than you. She turned to Grace, her eyes blazing. Call security. I want her out of here. Grace didn't move. Her hands clutched the clipboard tight, her knuckles white. Laura, she said, her voice shaking but firm. Maybe we should. Laura cut her off. Now, Grace, she barked. Grace flinched, but didn't budge, her eyes flicking to Naomi like she was asking for help. Naomi gave her a small nod, barely noticeable, but it was enough. Grace took a step back, her breath hitching. Laura spun back to Naomi, her face a mask of fury. You're done, she said, her voice rising. I don't care who you think you are. You're not staying up here. She gestured toward the back of the plane, her hand trembling just enough to show she wasn't as sure as she sounded. Naomi met her gaze, unblinking. We'll see about that, she said, soft but loaded with promise. The plane droned on, cutting through the clouds, but down in the cabin, the real storm was just getting started. Laura thought she had the upper hand, but something in Naomi's calm, her quiet, unshakable calm, said otherwise. Whatever was coming, it was going to hit hard, and Laura didn't even know what she'd unleashed. The cabin lights flickered as the plane hit a patch of turbulence, but the real shake-up was happening down below. Laura Hensley stood in the aisle, her arms crossed so tight it looked like she might snap her own elbows. Her face was a storm cloud, red, blotchy, and ready to burst. Naomi Carter sat calm as ever, her damp slacks clinging to her legs, her phone resting on the armrest like a loaded gun nobody else could see. Grace Miller lingered near the galley, clutching that clipboard like it was her last lifeline, her blue eyes darting between Laura and Naomi. Frank Delaney watched it all unfold, his newspaper long forgotten, a faint smirk tugging at his lips like he knew the punchline was coming. Laura wasn't backing down. She leaned closer to Naomi, her voice loud enough to bounce off the gold-trimmed walls. You think a name on a list means anything? She said, her words sharp as broken glass. I've been doing this job for 15 years. I know a troublemaker when I see one. She jabbed a finger toward the back of the plane. You don't belong up here, and that's final. The nosy woman in the back nodded like she'd just heard gospel, whispering to her neighbor, she's got some nerve, acting like she owns the place. Naomi didn't bite. She uncrossed her legs slow, her movements deliberate, and looked up at Laura with eyes that could have cut steel. 15 years, she said, her voice low but steady, and you still don't know how to treat people right. That's the real trouble here. The words landed soft but heavy, like a brick wrapped in velvet. Frank let out a low whistle, leaning back in his seat. She's got you there, he muttered, loud enough for Laura to hear. Laura's head snapped toward him, her glare venomous, but she didn't take the bait. Not yet. Grace shifted her weight, her fingers tracing the edge of the clipboard. She'd seen Naomi's name, Seat 3A, marked VIP, in tiny print, and it didn't add up with Laura's tantrum. She took a shaky step toward the galley, her voice barely a whisper. I'm going to check with the captain, she said, more to herself than anyone else. Laura caught it, though. What? She barked, spinning around. You're not checking anything. I said I got this. Grace froze, her face paling, but her feet didn't move back. She glanced at Naomi, who gave her that same small nod, like a lifeline tossed across the aisle. Laura didn't notice. She was too busy pacing, her polished shoes clicking hard against the carpet. You're wasting everyone's time, she said, turning back to Naomi. I'm calling security as soon as we land, and you'll be lucky if they don't drag you off in cuffs. She smirked, thinking she'd won, but there was a tremble in her hands she couldn't hide. Naomi tilted her head, her expression unreadable. You're sure about that? She asked, her tone calm but loaded. Laura faltered just for a second, then forced a laugh. Oh, I'm sure, she said. You picked the wrong flight to mess with me. The plane leveled out, the turbulence fading, but the tension kept climbing. Grace slipped away while Laura ranted, ducking into the galley with the clipboard tucked under her arm. She pulled the curtain shut, her breath shaky as she grabbed the intercom phone. "Captain," she whispered, her voice trembling, "it's Grace. We got a situation. Passenger in 3A, Naomi Carter. She's listed as VIP, but Laura's losing it. She hit her." There was a long pause on the other end. Then a gruff voice crackled back. "Stay put. I'll handle it." Grace hung up, her heart pounding. She peeked out, catching Naomi's eye through the gap in the curtain. Naomi didn't smile, but there was a flicker of something, trust, maybe, that kept Grace from crumbling. Back in the cabin, Laura was still running her mouth. "People like you always think you can talk your way out of anything," she said, her voice rising. "Well, not today. Not with me." She pointed at Naomi again, her finger shaking. "You're nobody here." Frank snorted, louder this time. "Keep telling yourself that," he said, crossing his arms. Laura's face twisted, but before she could snap back, the cockpit door swung open. The captain stepped out, a stocky guy in his 50s, gray hair peeking from under his cap, his face tight with something that looked like dread. Laura straightened up, smoothing her uniform like she'd just been handed a win. "Captain," she said, her tone shifting to sugar sweet. "I was just about to call you. We got a disruptive passenger here." She gestured to Naomi, but the captain cut her off with a raised hand. "Enough," he said, his voice low and firm. He glanced at Naomi, then back at Laura, his jaw clenched. "I just got a call from headquarters. The owner of this plane's on board. Naomi Carter." He nodded toward Naomi, his words dropping like a bomb. The cabin erupted, gasps, murmurs, a choked "what?" from the nosy woman in the back. Laura's smirk vanished, her face draining of color. That can't be right," she stammered, her hands dropping to her sides. "There's got to be a mistake." The captain shook his head. "No mistake," he said. "She's the boss, and you've been treating her like dirt." Frank chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound. "Told you that hole was deep," he said, leaning back with a grin. Naomi didn't move, didn't gloat. She just sat there, her damp clothes sticking to her, her cheeks still red from Laura's hand. But her eyes, those dark, steady eyes, shifted, taking in the room like she was seeing it new. She'd built Carter Air from nothing, poured her life into making it a place where people mattered, no matter who they were. And now, here was Laura, tearing that down with every word, every sneer. If she let this slide, what did that say about everything she'd fought for? She took a slow breath, her fingers brushing her phone again. She wasn't just mad, she was scared. Scared that her dream was slipping through her hands, rotting from the inside. Laura scrambled, her voice pitching high. "I didn't know," she said, turning to the captain. She didn't say anything. She just sat there acting like the captain cut her off again. "Doesn't matter," he said. "You don't slap a passenger. Period." He glanced at Naomi, his tone softening. "Miss Carter, what do you want to do?" Naomi didn't answer right away. She looked at Laura, then at Grace peeking from the galley, then back at the captain. "We're landing," she said, her voice quiet but final. "Now." Laura's eyes widened. "Landing?" she sputtered. "We're halfway to—" The captain didn't let her finish. "You heard her," he said, turning back toward the cockpit. "Buckle up, everyone." The intercom crackled to life a second later. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're making an unscheduled landing. Please stay seated." The cabin buzzed with confusion, folks whispering, craning their necks. Frank leaned toward Naomi, his voice low. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" he said. Naomi didn't smile, didn't nod. She just stared ahead, her mind racing. Laura wasn't done. She stormed up the aisle, her face a mix of panic and fury. "You can't do this," she shouted, pointing at Naomi. "I'll call security myself. I'll make sure you're—" She stopped cold as Naomi stood up, slow and deliberate, her full height unfolding like a quiet threat. "You've done enough," Naomi said, her voice cutting through Laura's rant like a knife. "Sit down." Laura opened her mouth, then shut it, her hands shaking as she backed off. The nosy woman gasped, clutching her pearls. Grace slipped out of the galley, her eyes wide, but steady now, like she'd found her footing. The plane dipped, the engines whining as it started its descent. Laura sank into a jump seat, her head in her hands, muttering to herself. She thought she had control, thought she'd won. But Naomi's calm, that unshakable quiet, was unraveling her piece by piece. The captain's words echoed in her head. She's the boss. Laura's stomach twisted. She'd slapped the woman who signed her checks, and now the ground was rushing up to meet them. Whatever Naomi had planned, it was coming fast, and Laura was out of moves. The plane touched down smooth as butter on a small airstrip just outside Portland, the tires kissing the tarmac with a soft screech. Outside, the Oregon sky hung heavy with clouds, a faint drizzle streaking the windows. Inside, the cabin was a mess of murmurs and wide eyes, every passenger glued to the drama that had just gone from bad to downright wild. Naomi Carter stood tall in the aisle, her navy blazer still damp, her cheeks still flushed from Laura Hensley's slap. But her face? Pure style. She'd taken enough sneers, enough disrespect, and now she was done playing quiet. Laura slumped in the jump seat, her hands gripping her knees like they were the only thing keeping her upright. Her uniform was still crisp, but her face was a wreck, pale, sweaty, eyes darting like a cornered animal. She thought she was in charge, thought she could push Naomi around and walk away clean. Now, with the plane on the ground and the captain's words ringing in her ears, she's the boss, she knew she'd miscalculated. Badly. Frank Delaney watched from his seat, his arms crossed, a faint grin tugging at his weathered face. Grace Miller hovered near the galley, her ponytail limp, but her eyes steady for the first time all day. The cabin door hissed open, and two figures climbed aboard, sharp suits, sharper strides. Naomi's assistants, a man and a woman, both in their 30s, moved like they owned the place. "Miss Carter," the woman said, her voice warm but clipped, "everything's ready for your review." The man nodded, holding a tablet, his gaze flicking to Laura for half a second before dismissing her entirely. Naomi adjusted her blazer, smoothing out a wrinkle like it was the last loose and she'd tie up. She turned to the captain, who'd stepped back into the cabin, his cap tucked under his arm. "I want this handled," she said, her voice low but firm. Right now, Laura's head snapped up, her mouth opening to protest, but no sound came out. The assistants parted, and Naomi stepped forward, her presence filling the space like a quiet storm. She looked at Laura, her dark eyes locking on like a laser. "Laura Hensley," she said, her tone even but cutting. "I'm Naomi Carter. I own this plane. I own Carter Air. And you've spent the last hour proving you don't belong here." The words hit like a gavel, final and heavy. Gasps rippled through the cabin. The nosy woman in the back clutched her purse, her jaw dropping. Frank nodded slow, like he'd seen this coming from a mile away. Laura stammered, her voice cracking. I didn't know," she said, her hands flailing. "You didn't say anything. You just sat there." Naomi held up a hand, silencing her cold. "I shouldn't have to say who I am for you to treat me like a human being," she said. "You judged me the second I walked on this plane. You ignored me, you insulted me, and then you hit me, all because you thought I didn't matter. That's not just a mistake. That's who you are." Laura's face crumpled, her bravado gone, replaced by a raw, scrambling panic. The captain shifted his weight, glancing at Naomi. "Miss Carter," he said, "we can call security, have her escorted off." Naomi shook her head. "Not yet," she said. She turned back to Laura, her voice dropping lower, sharper. "You've humiliated yourself in front of everyone here. You've disrespected a passenger, me, and you've trashed the name of this airline. I built Carter Air to be about people, not prejudice. And you're the opposite of everything I stand for." Laura's hands shook, her eyes darting to the passengers, searching for a lifeline. She found none. Frank stared her down, his grin gone, replaced by a hard look. The couple in the back whispered, their heads shaking. Naomi took a step closer, her voice steady as granite. "You're fired," she said. "Effective immediately." Laura gasped, a choked sound escaping her throat. "No, please, Miss Carter," she begged, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean it. I didn't know. Naomi's expression didn't soften. You didn't mean to get caught, she said, cold and clear. But you did, and now you're done. Laura's knees buckled, and she sank back into the seat, tears streaking her face. The cabin went silent, the weight of Naomi's words settling over everyone like dust after a storm. Before Laura could say another word, the sound of boots thudded up the steps. 2 police officers stepped aboard, their uniforms crisp, their faces all business. Miss Carter, one said, tipping his hat, we got your report. Are you pressing charges? Naomi didn't hesitate. Yes, she said, her voice firm. She assaulted me in front of witnesses. I want her held accountable. The officer nodded, pulling a pair of cuffs from his belt. Ma'am, he said to Laura, you're under arrest for assault. Anything you say can be used against you. Laura's eyes went wide, her breath hitching. Wait, this is a mistake, she cried, scrambling back as the officer approached. I didn't mean, please, Miss Carter, I'm sorry. Naomi didn't flinch. Your apology's too late, she said, her tone flat. You made your choices. Now you live with them. The cuffs clicked around Laura's wrists, the sound sharp in the quiet cabin. She sobbed, her head dropping as the officers led her down the aisle, her once proud stride reduced to a stumble. Naomi turned to the passengers, her posture easing just a fraction. Folks, she said, her voice softening, I'm sorry you had to see this. This isn't what Carter Air's about. Moving forward, I'll make sure every person on my planes gets the respect they deserve. No exceptions. The cabin erupted in applause, slow at first, then loud and steady. Frank clapped hard, a rare smile breaking across his face. The nosy woman joined in, her hands fluttering like she'd just seen a miracle. Grace stepped forward, her eyes shining, clapping quiet but proud. Naomi glanced at Grace, her expression warming. Grace, she said, you did the right thing today. I noticed. You'll hear from my office about a promotion. Grace's jaw dropped, her hands freezing mid-clap. Thank you, Miss Carter, she whispered, her voice thick with gratitude. Naomi nodded, then turned to her assistants. Let's go, she said, stepping toward the door. The passengers watched her go, their applause fading into a murmur of awe. Outside, the drizzle had stopped, the air cool and clean against Naomi's skin. A black SUV waited on the tarmac, its driver holding the door. She slid inside, her assistants briefing her on the next steps. New policies, staff retraining, but her mind lingered on the plane. That slap, that terrible mistake had cost Laura everything. But it had given Naomi something too, a chance to set things right, not just for her, but for everyone who'd ever been looked down on. She gazed out the window as the jet shrank into the distance, a question tugging at her. Could respect really become the norm, or was this just one fight in a war that'd never end? The SUV pulled away, the airstrip fading behind her. Naomi leaned back, a faint smile touching her lips. She turned humiliation into a lesson, one that'd echo far beyond this flight. And as the world rolled by outside, she knew one thing for sure. Sometimes the quietest victories were the ones that changed everything. Hey folks, you've just flown through Naomi's incredible story with us, and we're so grateful you were along for the ride.
Hey, folks, you were just flown through now coincidental story with us, and we are so grateful you were along for the ride. If her five for red hit you right in the heart, Samak thắt like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment below, we would love to hear what you think. Stick with us, because we have got more story like this coming your way, as of rich, justice, and real people making a difference. Click that next video, and let's keep the journey going together.